Hey folks, I'm Allison. Welcome to my BookTube channel. Today I'm reviewing the books that I read in July and August. The first book that I read was The Book Eaters by Sunyi. This is a book about a woman named Dylan who is a book eater, which is a kind of magical fairy creature who eats books instead of food. They have supernatural abilities, they're stronger, faster than humans, and they live a lot longer. The book eaters have a sort of closed society that is mostly separated away from humans so that the humans don't find out about their abilities. But there's a strain of book eaters called mind eaters who, instead of eating books, basically suck people's sort of memory and personality and being out of their brains, and that's their sustenance. And those mind eaters are kept by a group of book eaters called the Knights. Most of the book eaters are divided into different households that are headed by a patriarch who sets the rules for how the household is going to live, and all of his family live sort of on a big estate for each house. But the Knights live separately, and they are in charge of doing two things. One, keeping control of the mind eaters, and the second is planning marriages between the different houses, because in the book eater world, male babies are born much more frequently than female babies. And so there are very few book eater women, and they, as a result, the society sort of sets up arranged marriages between the houses to ensure that the species continues, basically. And the main character, Dylan, has one of these arranged marriages and has a child, and the child turns out to be a mind eater, and she doesn't want it to have to live the life of the mind eaters, because actually it's not a very nice life the way that they're treated by the Knights who keep control of them. And so she runs away. And the story is about her attempts to basically escape this really patriarchal society that she was born into and find a new way to live, for her and her son to live free from the book eaters. But it's also a really interesting exploration of what lengths we are willing to go to protect the people that we love, particularly when the people that we love are a threat to others. So one of the real fascinating and constant themes of this book is that Dylan's child kills people, and she is complicit in helping him, find victims and kill them. And the book's philosophy on that really reminded me a lot of this Friedrich Nietzsche quote that I've just heard online. I don't know the context for the quote, so I can't swear that I'm using it properly. But the acts done out of love always take place beyond good and evil, because she has made the choice that she's going to try to provide a nice life for her child and is gonna do it at any cost. She's sort of, thinks to herself in the book several times, once you've made the choice that you're going to do everything you can for the person you love, then there are no moral red lines. And that makes Dylan a very gray character. She is quite a sort of anti-hero in this book. Even though you're rooting for her, at the same time, I think there is a real sense that she is not a good person and that her child is not a good person. And even though they're acting out of desperation, that they are making really irredeemable choices. And so I found her to be a really fun character to spend time with. I think morally gray characters can be some of the most fun, especially when the book recognizes that the characters are morally gray. I think it's important for me, when I'm enjoying a book about a character who is not a good person, that the perspective of the book understands that this character is not a good person. When characters just commit atrocities and the book is just unabashedly rooting for them. I often find it really frustrating and am not able to connect. But in this book, the book is very aware that Dylan is committing atrocities, and Dylan is very aware of it. And so that made her a really dark but compelling character to follow. I thought the pacing of this book was also quite good. You start in sort of the present day with a bunch of the story having happened. You know, Dylan is already on the lam with her child, and then you sort of slowly over the course of the book start to unravel the history of how they got there and what happened. And that the book does a very good job, I think, jumping between those two storylines. I didn't at any point feel like I was rushing through either one of those timelines to get back to the other. And I think can be quite tricky to do for a book with multiple timelines. And so I thought that was really well done. The ending of the book fell a little flat for me. It ends in sort of a big battle, essentially, and it didn't really seem like the choices that the characters were making throughout the book or the things we were learning about their characters were really implicated in the way that it all sort of panned out. It sort of just seems like there's a battle, and I'm not going to sort of spoil exactly how the book ends, but it didn't feel like an ending where I was like, oh yes, this is really gratifying. It's, exactly the right payoff for all the buildup we've seen. It felt like the book just sort of ended. But one thing I really did like about this book was the sort of light touch queer romance in it. Dylan is a lesbian, and she meets a woman who becomes a sort of significant secondary character in the book, who is a total badass and very fun, and I liked her a lot, and I really liked the chemistry between the two characters. And I wasn't expecting a queer romance going into this book, and so that was a fun treat. Overall, I would probably give this book a 7 out of 10. It was good. It wasn't incredible, but I would definitely recommend it. I think it was a really fun read. It was thought-provoking while I was reading it, but I don't think it will stick with me. I don't think I'm going to be thinking back to this book, in the coming years. But that said, I thought it was both very fun and quite thought-provoking to read as I was reading. The second book was The Idiot by Elif Batuman. I really, really liked this book. I know that it is quite controversial because nothing really happens in it. This is a book about a young woman who is the daughter of Turkish immigrants, and she matriculates her first year at Harvard, and it's just about basically the people she meets, her roommates and the friends that she makes in her classes, and this upperclassman that she develops a crush on, Ivan, a Hungarian student who is, a Hungarian international student who is studying at Harvard. They're in a Russian class together, and basically the characters just go to classes and they go to coffee shops and they study and they decorate their dorm rooms and have awkward conversations. And the entire time that the main character, Selin is her name, is sort of having this crush on Ivan. Ivan has a series of other girlfriends that he's dating, and so they hang out as friends, basically. They're in a sort of situationship, but nothing overtly romantic or sexual ever happens because Ivan's in these other relationships. And also Ivan is quite an ambiguous character. This book, you're really, really in Selin's head. And so everything is from her perspective. And so she's very confused by Ivan, and Ivan is presented as a very confusing character. And you never really know throughout the book if he's interested in her at all, or if he really is just likes the attention of hanging out with someone who clearly has a crush on him. It's a book that really feels like the experience of being in college, where you're just there and stuff's happening, but it's really unclear what that stuff means and if the stuff is leading to anything. And the ending of the book, people really do not like the ending of the book. Basically, the ending of the book and I don't think this is that big of a spoiler, is Ivan graduates and moves to a graduate program in California. And we just don't know what is going to happen next, if they're going to have any future communications or if that just is the end of their relationship. And I thought it was a brilliant ending, because that is how so many college relationships end. You know, people graduate and they move away and there's no resolution. They just sort of fade out of your life. You know, there's so many people that I knew in college that I hung out with regularly that once we graduated, we just never spoke again. And there was no falling out. It wasn't like we actively decided we didn't want to be friends anymore. We just, whatever the bonds were that were holding us together, turned out to have way more to do with sort of geography and convenience. And once we were no longer living on the same campus, there just wasn't enough motivation on either side of the relationship to like keep it alive. And so, you know, this book ending with Ivan just moving to California to start his next stage of life, and potentially the relationship, you know, between Selin and this boy she had a crush on in college just sort of fizzling and never going anywhere because they're not together in college anymore. That felt so incredibly realistic to me, and it felt like such an appropriate resolution to this story, because the story, really, the arc of the story is sort of following Selin's relationship with Ivan from sort of when she meets him at the beginning of her freshman year until when he graduates and moves away. And that felt like a complete story arc to me. I also really loved how meandering and philosophical, but also sort of nonsense, weed, college age philosophical this book was. You know, so much of the book is Selin just meditating about the things she's seeing, the way that people are acting, you know, the words. There's one point that really tickled me where she's looking at a book and a box of tissues and thinking to herself, even though both of them are just stacks of thin papers wrapped in a cardboard outer shell, they have such different purposes. And I think that's so funny, because that is exactly the kind of faux deep thinking about the world that you do in college. You know, you just are questioning everything and investigating everything and thinking about, you know, purpose and function and form and all of those philosophical ideas. And then because you're a kid and you don't know anything and you're just sort of getting your sea legs, you're applying these theories of things that you're thinking about to all sorts of nonsense situations and coming up with, you know, with these like deep thoughts about life. And I just thought that was hilarious and delightful. I really enjoyed the interpersonal relationships between Selin and her roommates too. There's a sort of weird power dynamic between the three roommates, where one of the roommates they live in like a triple room, but there's a double and a single. And one of the roommates gets there early and moves into the single room. And then the other roommate decides that she, you know, doesn't like that roommate. And there's a sort of weird unspoken power struggle between the three roommates, and Selin's sort of in the middle of it through the whole rest of the book. And that is the kind of thing that also happens so much in college, just these weird interpersonal conflicts that no one really understands, but you just end up sort of being battered around by them. I thought this book was absolutely delightful. It really, really resonated for me with my own experience of being this age and being in college. And you know, she goes at one point on a sort of summer, essentially study abroad program, and lives in this village in the Hungarian countryside. And it had such perfect summer college study abroad vibes, in the sense that no one was really benefiting that much from it. Everyone was sort of just doing it, but it turned out to be this sort of weird thing where she was staying with these families to sort of maybe teach them English, and they were just excited that there was an American there that they could speak English with, somebody who had, you know, she was just a novelty, right? She just had different experiences than everybody in this little rural village. And so they wanted to talk to her and see her and hang out with her, but it was really unclear that she's supposed to be like teaching the kids English. Really unclear that she's actually a value add to this village, or that this experience is in any way really valuable to her as a formative experience. It's kind of just a thing that she's doing. And that also was so funny to me and so accurate, I think, to so many of the experiences that I and my friends had in programs like that in college. Yeah, I have to say, I really love this book. I mean, it is kind of boring. I have to give the caveat that despite the fact that I really enjoyed it, it doesn't really have a plot. I don't think the author would probably quibble with that. And she has said she is trying to write sort of long, meandering, plotless novels, and she has definitely succeeded. I would give this a 9 out of 10. I really enjoyed this book. The next book that I read was Win Among Crows by Veronica Roth. It read to me, frankly, like a fan fiction. And not necessarily like a bad fan fiction, but just like a mediocre fan fiction. There's the main character who gets this magical flower and then goes to meet up with some demons to offer them the magical flower in exchange for helping him contact a powerful witch, Baba Yaga. So it's based on Russian folklore and mythology. And I often really like books that are set in that tradition. I really, really liked The Bear and the Nightingale, that series. But this book just didn't really feel like it did anything with it. Basically, this human somehow gets this flower and he goes and hooks up with these demons, and the main character sort of ends up with a crush on one of the demon guys, and they have a little bit of a romantic tension, and then they find Baba Yaga, and there's a sort of twist about the identity of the main character that you've been sort of being led up to the whole time. And so when it happened, I really was not at all surprised. Like I basically knew that it was going to happen. And then it's sort of like, despite the twist about his identity, he was basically being honest all along, and everything's kind of fine. Like it didn't really go anywhere. Like the characters were sort of fine, but really kind of flat. I mean, it's so short. This is one of the things about this book, is that it's really like a novella. Like the words on the page are huge, and and the book is how many pages is this? It's literally like 150 pages long, and it's trying to be a sort of fantasy epic, and it just you can't really do that in 150 pages, I don't think. And yeah, and it just fell really flat for me. So I would maybe give this book like a 5 out of 10. I mean, it wasn't atrocious. It wasn't offensive or anything. It was like kind of cute. It just, I would say it's like a sort of solid fanfic quality book. Yeah, 5 out of 10. The next book that I read was James by Percival Everett. I'm a bit nervous to give my review of this book because honestly, I didn't really like it, and it's gotten so much hype online, and it seems like people really, really like this book. It is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn from the perspective of Jim, the slave, who in this book goes by James. And it basically follows the plot of Huckleberry Finn, but there are certain parts of Huckleberry Finn where the two characters, James and Huck, are separated, and in Huckleberry Finn you follow Huck's version of events, and here you follow James's. And so you get slightly different plots, and then the ending, there's a pretty substantial divergence between how the sort of two books end. This book wasn't terrible. It was, it was compelling, it tugged at your heartstrings, it did a good job of really explaining and exploring both the like absolute horrific atrocity of slavery in the American South, while also combining that with with characters who really exemplified the way that so many people committing these atrocities were just normal people. Even people who seemed like they were good people in their sort of everyday life were complying with sort of the legal requirements of slavery, which of course was necessary to prop up the system. And so even the people that didn't themselves own slaves were really complicit in perpetuating and benefiting from slavery. There were also really interesting discussions of what it means to be Black in the system of slavery. Several different characters are mixed race, and some of them are mixed race and passing as white, and some of them are mixed race and slaves, and some of them are mixed race and no one knows it. And all of those characters have very different experiences of Blackness in this, in this society that is like so harshly divided based on whether you're Black or white. And all of that was really well done. But there was a sort of fundamental conceit at the core of the book that just didn't work for me. All of the slaves spoke sort of perfect Oxford English Dictionary, RP English. And the people that they're interacting with are mostly sort of poor whites in the South. And so, those people often speak with sort of Southern hillbilly grammar and slang and, don't have what you might think of as like perfect grammar. And all the slaves sort of code switch whenever they're around the white people to speak like slaves. So in Huck Finn, Jim speaks in, sort of slave English. And in this book, he speaks that way around the white people, but when the slaves are together away from the white people and when he's thinking his internal monologue, he is essentially hiding the fact that he knows how to speak with perfect grammar. And I didn't like that conceit for two reasons. One, it just felt quite unrealistic. I mean, I know this book itself has a sort of fantastical aspect to it in the way that Huck Finn has this sort of fantastical childhood adventure aspect to it, but it just felt so unrealistic that every single time the slaves were together, they switched into this sort of perfect English. But also, it felt like it was saying something about class and intelligence and education as embodied in sort of perfect English grammar that I don't really agree with. I tend to think that like proper language is language that accurately communicates what you want to say. And that the idea of, proper grammar versus improper grammar really is a sort of classist colonial invention, right? Like groups of people organically develop and change language among themselves all the time. And the idea that Oxford English Dictionary English is correct, is like smart and educated and good English, and that the way that people casually speak among each other, particularly groups of people who, are socially isolated, like slaves in the American South, and they were bringing their own cultures and their own languages and their own histories. And so, of course, different ways of speaking are going to organically develop in those communities in the same way that different ways of speaking organically develop in the American South versus other regions, right? And the problem is that the code switching was really tied up in this idea that the slaves were pretending to be stupid, pretending to not understand what was going on around them as a sort of safety mechanism around the white people. And I really liked that idea, right? There are times when Huck Finn thinks he's tricking Jim, and I think it made a lot of sense from James' perspective as an adult to be like, no, I understood what was happening. I just wasn't calling you out on it because I didn't feel safe doing so. But to then tie in that conception of actually understanding what's going on in the world and actually being smarter than the white people think you are, to tie that into speaking Oxford English Dictionary perfect English really seemed like it sort of devalued the completely valid way that people were actually speaking in this time. And I understand to some degree why one might want to do that. If a lot of the novel is going to be the internal monologue of a character, it's a lot easier on readers if that character speaks in a way that is easy for them to read, that matches up with the way that they speak and think. And so I understand not wanting to have to write all of James's monologues in, dialect or in the sort of old-timey Southern way that Huck speaks, for instance. But it really sort of every time it happened, it pulled me out of the story. And that, that meant that I was really sort of having to be pulled out of the story and get back in. I mean, just constantly throughout the whole novel. And that it made it quite difficult to read. And then the other thing that I didn't like, and this is a spoiler. So if you have not read this book, jump ahead 15 or 20 seconds. I really didn't like that James was revealed to be Huck's father. I felt like it really undermined the relationship between James and Huck. You're sort of developing throughout the book an exploration of what could the relationship have been like between this young white boy and an adult black slave, and Huck sort of learning and coming to question the systems of slavery that he, as a sort of young, unthinking child had just accepted as life. And I think creating this extra bond between them where actually Huck himself is mixed race, it turns out, and is just passing as white, even though he doesn't know it, and where James has developed affection for this boy, not because of the things that they've been through together, sort of in spite of the fact that Huck is white, but because Huck's his son. All of that really undermined the sort of central relationship in the book for me. And, I wouldn't say that this book is bad. It's clearly well written. It's clearly been well thought through. And, the author has done a good job finding the points of intersection and divergence with the original. So I might give this book maybe a 7 out of 10. But yeah, but I given sort of how, all of the prizes that it's won and all of the hype that there was around it, I was pretty disappointed. Switching gears into a book that absolutely met the very high hopes I had for it, the next book I read was Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. This is a book that takes place in 2 timelines. It's about a mother who all 3 of her adult daughters come home to the family cherry farm during COVID. And the sort of frame story is about the mother bonding with these 3 adult daughters and the daughters sort of dealing with the disruption of their, adulthood, young adulthood that is caused by COVID, and them sort of figuring out what they want to do with their lives. And they're all very different. One is planning to take over the family farm, and one is going to go be a vet, and then the other one wants to become an actress. And then during this sort of long period of being stuck bored at home, the mother is telling the 3 daughters the story of a summer that she dated a famous actor. And so the main story follows the mother from when she tried out for a role in a high school play through her sort of youth, almost becoming a sort of famous actress, and then ultimately, she doesn't. She leaves that world and, ends up on this farm. And it's absolutely delightful. It is so it is so well written. Ann Patchett is an incredible writer. I read The Dutch House a few months ago and gave it a 10 out of 10. I absolutely loved it. I don't think I liked this book quite as much as I liked The Dutch House, but I really, really liked it. It just did such a good job of recreating the vibes of the sort of old-timey Hollywood life that this woman was living. And a lot of it takes place at this place called Tom Lake, which is where a lot of sort of actors and dancers and people in the film business go to put on these summer shows, plays and musicals, and to sort of get discovered and sort of keep their skills up and that sort of thing. And it's just this really idyllic sort of young, hot, tan people running around and swimming and drinking and smoking and acting in plays and just, you know, dating each other and breaking up and getting up to all sorts of nonsense and playing tennis and, you know, driving around. And it's just such a vibe. I would say if you liked The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, you will really like this book. It's quite similar, both in terms of the sort of way that the frame story relates to the actual, you know, flashbacks story, and in terms of the really wonderful, saturated vibe of the sort of old-timey Hollywood life. And yeah, and it was just wonderful. It's the aesthetic of the cherry farm is so beautiful, the way that the sort of nature is described, and it's such a lovely exploration of what satisfaction in life looks like and how different people chase ambition and chase satisfaction in different ways. And it talks about all the different kind of ways that people sort of love each other and fall in love, and it really does a lovely job of sort of exploring the relationship between the mom and the three daughters. One criticism I will say is it felt a little bit unrealistic. The daughters act, I think, a bit younger than they are written to be, so they're sort of clamoring all over their mother to hear this story of her youth when she dated this famous actor, and she tells them this really long, meandering story over days and days and days, and every time they're just so excited to, you know, to get back and hear this story. And there's sort of a line in it where the mother thinks to herself that, you know, now that all the girls are home, they've sort of regressed a bit to their teenage selves. But it's still, I found it sort of a little bit like it pulled me out of the story, just that, you know, the daughters are supposed to be in their sort of early to mid 20s, and they often are acting, you know, like they're 16. And so that I just found a little bit sort of misjudged. But overall, it was just a lovely, beautiful story. I really, you know, it pulled me along. I really wanted to sort of find out how everything turns out, and there was a good twist, I thought, sort of 2/3 of the way through the book that really, you know, fit everything together nicely and sort of tied it up with a little bow. And, you know, I can go sort of back and forth, frankly, on whether I like that kind of thing. But I think I will say, you know, even as somebody who doesn't tend to love novels that sort of get tied up with a bow, I think she did a very good job. Like, it was very well executed. So I would give this a 9 out of 10. The last book that I read was The Backyard Bird Chronicles by Amy Tan. This book, I sort of misunderstood what it was. I thought it was going to be Amy Tan describing, you know, her life watching these birds, setting up bird feeders and caring for these birds. But that through that experience, you know, we were going to sort of bit by bit get a narrative about her and where she was in her life. And, you know, I thought it was going to have more sort of memoir vibes, but it's really about the birds. I would say this is almost kind of like a coffee table book. You know, it has these absolutely just beautiful, stunning illustrations in it, and these really funny little cartoons she does along with the illustrations that are talking about what the birds are up to. And the entries are quite short, you know. So this, for instance, this is one standalone entry, and it's just this one page, and then it goes along with this little cartoon of the birds sort of getting up to the things she describes them doing in the daily entry. And so I think this would be a really cool book to have sort of, you know, as a coffee table book, where someone could pick it up and really just read one page of it as a standalone and, you know, flip through the little illustrations, and it would be really fun and beautiful. And obviously, you know, Amy Tan's a wonderful writer. The little entries are very well written, and the shenanigans and interpersonal dynamics that the birds are getting up to are quite engaging, but it's not a book, I think, that really lends itself to sort of sitting down and reading 50, 100 pages of in a go. So I would probably give this book like an 8 out of 10 for what it is, and just with the caveat that you have to sort of understand what this book is trying to do. And it really is a book about birds. Like, it's not a book about Amy Tan via birds. It's just a book about birds. So there you have it. These are the 6 books that I read in July and August. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And as always, thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video.